History as it happens, December 16th, 2021. Ranking the Presidents, Part 2.
People have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned...
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
It is a crisis that strikes at the very heart and soul and spirit of our national will. We can see this crisis in the growing doubt about the meaning of our own lives.
I just want to find 11,780 votes, which is one more than we have.
We've been lucky to have some great presidents during trying times, but the American past is littered with more than a few terrible leaders, men who failed to meet the moment, from disunion to depression. But most presidents, it seems, fall somewhere in the middle. Depending on your perspective, of course. One man's mediocrity could be another man's villain. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
That there is a president of the United States who encouraged, or at the least endorsed, a violent protest at the United States Capitol whose design was to stop the certification of an election.
They say in politics it's easier to define what you're against rather than what you're for. I mean, how often in a presidential election did you vote for one candidate simply because you detested his or her opponent? Well, welcome to part 2 of Let's Rank the Presidents, and in this episode we're going to cover the worst chief executives in American history, as well as those who are somewhere in the middle. Now, at the beginning of the episode, you heard the voices of Nixon, Lyndon Johnson, Jimmy Carter, and Donald Trump in what were among their worst moments in office. One of those men is near the very bottom of the survey by the Siena College Research Institute. We mentioned that survey in part 1 of this series, the episode right before this one. And it was Donald Trump, ranked number 42 overall, twice impeached, the second time for inciting a riot in his effort to overturn the results of an election, the only president not to accept the peaceful transfer of power.
The people of Georgia are angry. The people of the country are angry. And there's nothing wrong with saying that, that you've recalculated.
Now, maybe you're thinking it's too early to rate Trump's presidency. Our views could change as partisan emotions cool with the passage of time. Even Nixon's reputation made a partial comeback after the disgrace of Watergate. Nixon is ranked 29th in the Siena College survey of historians and political scientists.
There can be no stable and enduring peace without the participation of the People's Republic of China and its 750 million people.
Nixon did open the door to China. He established the EPA, among other policy achievements that somewhat removed the stain of Watergate. What about the tweeners like Lyndon Johnson? The survey has him ranked 16th overall. Not bad. For civil rights and voting rights, Medicare and Medicaid. But Johnson's prosecution of the Vietnam War was so disastrous and dishonest that he refused to seek another term in a stunning announcement on March 31st, 1968.
I do not believe that I should devote an hour or a day of my time to any personal partisan causes or to any duties other than the awesome duties of this office.
So maybe giving each president one overall grade or ranking really doesn't tell the story. Maybe Johnson deserves 2 grades, one for domestic policy and civil rights, and another for the epic tragedy of Vietnam. Now, before we continue our conversation with our 2 presidential scholars, a reminder, we're not going to get to every president on the list, and you can blame me, the meandering interviewer, if we neglect to cover someone you wanted to hear about. Jeremi Suri is a historian at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. He is the host of a podcast called This is Democracy. And Jeffrey Engel is the founding director of the Center for Presidential History at Southern Methodist University, and he hosts a podcast too, The Past, the Promise, the Presidency. Jeremi Suri, welcome back.
Nice to be with you, Martin.
Jeffrey Engel, welcome back.
Good to talk to you.
We wrapped up part one talking about Ronald Reagan, so as I was preparing for part two of our conversation, my mind drifted to Reagan's predecessor, Jimmy Carter, who many conservatives consider to have been a terrible president. You might say he had horrible luck. He didn't cause many of the problems he encountered, but he also didn't necessarily respond to, and I'm not saying Carter is the worst ever, but we're going to start with Carter. He didn't really respond to what happened very well. Who would like to take on Carter? Does he really deserve to be considered such a horrible president?
No, I don't think so. I'll start us off. There have been a couple of very good biographies of Carter that have recently been written by Kai Bird and Jonathan Alter, and they make an important point. He's certainly not a great president, but this was someone who actually tried to do a lot of good things that did have enduring impact. For example, he's the first president to really articulate the importance of human rights and put the United States front and center on the side of supporting human rights, particularly in Latin America and other parts of the world. He also is the president who responds very strongly to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and really begins the American resistance to Soviet expansion in that area. He's a man of great honesty and integrity, but someone who, unfortunately, and this comes through in these positive biographies, he has a deep flaw, Carter does, which is that he doesn't suffer fools. He's someone who thinks he, kind of like Herbert Hoover, has all the right answers, isn't someone who's open to really working with different political points of view, even within his own party. And I just want to tell a really quick story. Tip O'Neill, who is, of course, at that time a Boston politician, Irish politician, the Speaker of the House, the head of the Democratic majority in the House of Representatives. Jimmy Carter does not make any personal appeal to Tip O'Neill. He doesn't reach out to Tip O'Neill's concerns. He tries to impose his concerns on Tip O'Neill, and this leads to a disaster within his own party. So it's not that Carter's a bad person. He isn't. It's not that his policy aims are bad. They're actually quite good. It's that he's not a very good politician, and you cannot be a successful president if you are not a good politician.
The Malaise speech.
It is a crisis of confidence. It is a crisis that strikes at the very heart and soul and spirit of our national will.
Everyone listening to this should go look that up on YouTube and ask yourself, is that the tone the President of the United States should be setting? Jeffrey, Jimmy Carter.
I think the Malaise speech is a useful place to end in many ways because he does not do what Reagan does, which is he does not give the nation a lodestar to aim towards. He does not give us a destination in the same way that Reagan did. And I think the comparison between Carter and Reagan is fascinating because I think if we're ranking IQs, which I know is problematic for all kinds of sociological reasons, if we're ranking IQs, I might put Carter at the very top of the list of presidents. I mean, the man designed nuclear reactors for submarines, after all. I might put Reagan, frankly, towards the bottom of the list. And I think that tells us a lot about their presidencies, that Reagan knew what he knew and had rules, almost religious rules about government that he wanted to live by. And those are very easy to convey, therefore, to his followers. Carter, I think, saw so much complexity that he wound up being hidebound by it, that he could not make many of the choices that were in front of him because he understood so many choices, whereas Reagan had a smaller menu, if you will.
Intellectuals don't always make for good presidents. And Carter
They usually don't. They usually don't.
All right. So Andrew Johnson is considered, at least according to the Siena College Research Institute survey, to be the worst president. Is he at or near the bottom of your lists, guys?
He's certainly at or near the bottom of mine. I actually think Trump and Johnson are rivals for the worst presidents. These are the only two presidents who actually took action against the U.S. government and against the U.S. Constitution. Andrew Johnson did everything he could to resist the changes that were brought on by the Civil War, including the legal changes. And he's the first president to really use his veto to try to prevent Congress from doing anything. Andrew Jackson used the veto, but not anywhere near in the ways in which Andrew Johnson did. The most significant failing of Andrew Johnson's was to pardon all of the secessionists, all of the treasonous individuals, not just those who fought as foot soldiers in the Confederate military, but those were the leaders. Those who went and fought in Mexico for the French-supported Emperor of Mexico, Maximilian, against the U.S. government, then came back and were pardoned by Andrew Johnson, and then became politicians in states like our own here in Texas. They wrote the voting laws because of Andrew Johnson. He let the Confederates write the voting laws in our state, which are still a problem, obviously. So this is a man who directly undermines the Union from the office of the presidency. You cannot do any worse as president.
And Lincoln chose him as, or the party chose him as vice president because he was a Unionist from the eastern part of Tennessee, which was less slavery dependent.
Yeah, he opposed secession, but he didn't buy into the Union program beyond that. So he was white supremacist Unionist.
He was terrible. Jeffrey, anything to add to?
I think he's a president that looks bad at the time. We know this because he was impeached, and he looks bad over time. His views, especially on race, are just beyond the pale at this point. It's important to note that he was not ashamed of these. He was very proud of these views.
Great point, because some presidents' legacies do look better or worse over time. Sometimes it's not fair to judge someone right away. We'll get to Trump in a minute. James Buchanan, another disaster. Jeffrey Engel, go ahead.
Buchanan's at the bottom of the list, not for what he does, but for what he doesn't do. The easiest charge against him, which is also most accurate, was one of the people that understood that a break was coming, that a crisis was coming, that a civil war was looming, and Buchanan chose to do nothing. One can argue whether there is anything that could have been done, but he didn't try.
The only thing I'd add is the few things Buchanan does are to actually help the Southerners and help the secessionists. So
even though he was a Northerner.
Even though he's from Pennsylvania, right? But he's a Democrat, and he takes actions that actually go beyond even where the Northern Democrats were. I think his goal was that in giving the Southerners more of what they wanted, maybe they wouldn't secede, but that was clearly only more kindling on the fire.
So many people who read the Washington Times might disagree with discussing Donald Trump. In this part of our 2-episode series, Donald Trump, his record, right? So there's this two ways of looking at Trump, that he had a record that could have been done by what my older brother calls robot Republican. Cut taxes, deregulate, appoint conservative justices. And then there's Donald Trump's impeachment for the Ukraine pressure campaign, impeachment for inciting a riot to attack Congress, undermining public confidence in the election, trying to overturn the election, not just with the riot. I mean, that wasn't going to work. His calls to secretaries of state in Georgia and elsewhere, pressuring the Justice Department to say the election was fraudulent. Is all that enough to say right now, just a year out from the end of his term, that he belongs near the bottom or among the bottom dwellers?
Yes. And he will only look worse with time. Look, we can have a policy argument about Trump, and maybe we should, but if we're just ranking presidents, let's be clear. The president takes an oath to defend the Constitution, and Andrew Johnson's the only one who comes close to violating that oath. Donald Trump violated that oath. When you launch a coup against your own society, he is the only president in our history, and let's hope that it remains true 200 years from now, when another group of historians are talking about 400 to 500 years of American democracy. Let's hope they can say what I'm saying now. He is the only president to try to undermine an election and then to try to overthrow the government of the United States. He launched a coup, and we don't use those words in our history for any other figure. You launch a coup against our government, you are beyond the pale. And whether he was convicted of his impeachment or not, he deserved to be impeached, and he deserved to be thrown out of office, and we should never have a president like him again.
Well, I forgot to mention his callous and inept response to the pandemic, which was going to be bad regardless.
Now, the virus that we're talking about having to do, a lot of people think that goes away in April with the heat. When you have 15 people, and the 15 within a couple of days is going to be down to close to zero. It's going to disappear. One day it's like a miracle. It will disappear.
But his inaction and callousness at the start made things worse. Jeffrey, anything to add about Trump?
Yeah, I think your point about the pandemic is actually a really useful one, because I think that we actually need a separate category of bad for Trump in the following way. And Jeremy's already alluded to this eloquently, that there are presidents who make bad decisions. There are presidents who create bad policies. There are presidents who even have bad intent. We've not seen a president who actively tried to undermine the Constitution that he had sworn to defend. One way to do this, and I think this is one way to try to get past the partisan divide, it's impossible though it might be today, try to have a veil of ignorance, as John Rawls used to suggest. You don't know if you're a Republican or a Democrat. You don't know if you're rich or you're poor, you're black or you're white. You don't know anything about yourself. And I give you the following sentence. And I'm going to try to give the sentence as neutrally as possible, that there is a president of the United States who encouraged or at the least endorsed a violent protest at the United States Capitol whose design was to stop the certification of an election. You don't know anything else besides that sentence. It's hard to say that that's a good guy.
And then watched it on television approvingly.
And cheered it on. Exactly. So I think we have not, in 2021, let's give ourselves a little bit of a break on this one because we do need time to process these things. I think the American people have not fully come to appreciate just what it meant to have a president actively acting seditiously.
And if we come out of this stronger, we might look back on it and say, well, at the time we were really concerned about that, but it turned out not to be so bad. It's still terrible. The motivation was there. Richard Nixon, he's in the middle of the Siena College survey, which is surprising because for many people he epitomizes or personifies presidential malfeasance. He did not have to do what he did. Jeremy, where do you put Nixon?
Well, Nixon is difficult to judge because unlike Trump and Andrew Johnson, Nixon was very serious about policy. He was a serious thinker about policy and surrounded himself with serious people. You can like or dislike Henry Kissinger, but he's a serious person. Weighing Henry Kissinger with the interim appointments that Trump made, you have just two very different worlds. And so Nixon was serious about policy, but he also abused his power as president. And so that's what makes him complicated. But he had a very sophisticated policy toward dealing with the Soviet Union and China, what came to be known as détente. He had a very sophisticated policy led mostly by Kissinger, but strongly supported by Nixon in the Middle East, shuttle diplomacy, as it comes to be called. And at home, Nixon actually increased funding for many domestic programs that are later popular with Democrats. The EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, is created under Richard Nixon. He increases grants to cities, block grants to cities. On the policy level, you can see Nixon as in some ways, a pretty decent president.
Except for Vietnam. His prosecution of the war in Vietnam was lousy.
Well, of course, and he lied about that as well, and particularly the bombing of Cambodia in May of 1970, and then his misuse of policing power against domestic critics, student protesters, civil rights activists, and others.
The IRS.
That doesn't really distinguish him too much from Lyndon Johnson. Who was more responsible for the war in Vietnam, right. Also lied about the war and did some similar things, though not on the same scale. The difference is that Nixon went beyond the misuse of military power at home and abroad to actually use the office of the presidency to target enemies and to use the office in many ways to try to undermine the other branches of government in the United States.
Jeffrey, would you say that the damage done to the institution of the presidency has not been fully undone even 60 years later, or was it 50 years after Nixon?
Oh, I don't think there's any question about that. And we have polling data to tell us this, that the faith of Americans in institutions broadly, not just the presidency, but in Congress and in other institutions across the country, in elites, have not recovered. It's gotten better over time until it's gotten worse over time. That's to say, Watergate was the nadir. But there is no doubt that I think Nixon's long-term consequences, I think in many ways need to be contrasted with Reagan's, in that Reagan, I would argue, moved the entire political spectrum to the right. So far, in fact, I agree with Jeremy that I think it's a good case to be made that Nixon would have been a conservative Democrat were he around today. But Nixon also gets credit, with that word in quotations, for giving us the political universe that we live in today. Remember, it's Nixon in 1968 who argues in favor of law and order, who argues essentially for dividing the society between those who he thinks should have a vote and those who want to have a vote. And I don't mean just vote in terms of the elections. I mean vote in terms of having a say in their lives. By 1972, Nixon is the one who gives us the Southern strategy, which of course puts racial division first and foremost as a topic of discussion in order to secure the South for the Republican Party. Obviously, he was very successful in doing so. And so we live in the political universe at least in terms of ideas and in terms of topics, in terms of language, in terms of divisions that Richard Nixon bequeaths us.
We don't need to spend a lot of time on Herbert Hoover because he's been trod upon for a long time. Actually, Nixon was 40 years ago. I guess he resigned. I said 50. Back to Hoover. I'm no mathematician, obviously. Hoover, like Carter, didn't cause the crises that subsumed his presidency, but he did not respond, to say the least, Jeremy. He did not respond very well to them. We can briefly go over Hoover. Go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So Herbert Hoover was the most successful international figure of his time until he was president. And that was actually the source of his downfall. It wasn't just the crisis of the Great Depression, is that he had been so successful for so long, he thought he had all the answers. And the Great Depression was caused by a variety of factors, most particularly the overproduction of American agriculture and the overinvestment in agriculture and agricultural-related activities, which he didn't fully understand. His misdiagnosis led him to believe that it was just a perturbation in the economic cycle that he could weather. And despite all the evidence to the contrary, as it comes into him after the crash, let's remember that the crash occurs in late 1929. He's president until 1933. He's very slow to take in the new information. And I think this is the downfall of any leader. When you are unwilling to learn new things, when you are unwilling to look at the facts, when you are unwilling to see that you might be wrong in your initial judgment, everyone can be wrong in their first or even second judgment of an issue. But if 3 years in, you're unwilling to see the difference, that makes you a failed leader. The American public saw that.
Jeffrey Engel, George W. Bush, the war in Iraq, the war on terrorism, the response to Hurricane Katrina. Pick it up from there.
Well, again, let's go back to my Rawlsian veil of ignorance. If I told you that a president would leave office with one of the worst economic climates in American history, so much so that we've used the word great in front of it, in this case, recession, not depression, but close. If I told you that we had a president who unsuccessfully prosecuted multiple wars, including of his own choosing, and I tell you a president that leaves with faith in the presidency at a near all-time low, Nixonian low, you would be hard-pressed to tell me that that was a successful president in the end. And George W. Bush, we should always remember, first and foremost, when we consider W, he did not have the presidency that he anticipated. He wanted to be a domestic president. He wanted to reform education. He wanted to reform taxes. He wanted to do, as you put it, robot Republican things.
Yes.
And then 9/11 happens. So we always have to remember when we're thinking about W that we essentially are evaluating a president who, by his own admission, was not prepared for the problems that he faced.
He was the decider. A lot of people want to blame Cheney, Rumsfeld, the neocons, but he was the man in charge.
I'm continually impressed by his faith in the concept of freedom that George, and you can see this in his second inaugural address most clearly, that George W. Bush believed freedom was good, freedom was a gift from God, and that the United States was a beacon of freedom and needed to be an exporter of freedom.
The best hope for peace in our world is the expansion of freedom in all the world.
And yet I would argue at no time in his presidency does he actually define what freedom is or what freedom means. So Osama bin Laden was quite explicit in his rhetoric that he was a freedom fighter. It's hard to imagine two people more different than Osama bin Laden and George W. Bush, and yet they both argued for the same thing. Well, that tells us that we need to be more clear in our language, I think. Clarity of language was not one thing that George W. Bush was known for.
I largely agree with everything that Jeff said. I would only add that we should remember that when George W. Bush took over as president, the American economy was in one of its strongest positions it had been in the last century. We were running budget surpluses, and just the opposite was true at the end of his presidency. And it was Bush himself who said that he wanted to be judged on his economic record. Yeah. It's hard to make a positive judgment there.
So blame the host here, but we haven't even talked about Andrew Jackson yet. Not in part one when we cover the top presidents, and not yet in part two when we're supposed to be covering the worst presidents and everyone in between. Andrew Jackson, highly consequential, but his treatment of Native Americans has him out of favor today. Who would like to take on King Andrew?
I'll say a couple of quick things about Andrew Jackson. I mean, he is the first president to really reach out to, shall we say, ordinary white Americans. He's the first president who's not from Virginia or Boston, right? And he is the common man's president, and that makes a big difference. He's a big supporter of the interests of the common man. And that's one of the reasons he's so consequential for the creation of the modern Democratic Party. On the other hand, though, he is brutal in his treatment of those he sees as not part of the population of common white men. So he's a defender of union, but also a defender of slavery. And he's an Indian killer. He's genocidal in his policies towards Native Americans. Those two things went hand in hand for him. So you loved Jackson or you hated him. There really isn't much in between.
He's a tough one, Jeffrey Engel, because he was consequential, as Jeremy explained.
Well, yes. I think if you're going to trace the evolution of the American presidency, which, of course, we now have a president today in the 21st century that is fundamentally predominant in all of American politics in a way I think the founders never envisioned and would have disapproved of. If you're going to trace the high points of the evolution of powerful presidents, you have to almost start with Jackson. He is the one who accrues more power to the White House than anyone before. And as the founders tried to tell us, power rarely recedes.
Well, now that we've gotten to Jackson, I'm thinking about a slew of 19th century presidents who are considered to have been unsuccessful, who are in this survey. Franklin Pierce, William Henry Harrison, who died after 32 days, Millard Fillmore, Zachary Taylor, John Tyler. James K. Polk was also a one-term president, but he is considered to have been a success.
Let me put in a quick plug for Tyler,
All right.
who rarely gets one. And rarely gets one in the 21st century.
No one liked him.
Well, no one liked him at the time. No one's liked him since, not least because he, of course, joins the Confederacy and serves in the Confederate Senate before he passes away. But let me give one positive. Other than that, yeah, sorry. One positive to Tyler. Remember, he is the first vice president to assume the presidency upon the death of the president. And his great contribution to American history is that he argued that he was therefore the president and was therefore able to have a presidential policy, and that the Constitution does not say the next guy up must continue the policies of the previous guy. It gives the president the power. And I think that that's actually very important. He did not allow the cabinet of his predecessor to run things. He said, I'm in charge. And that's one of the reasons they didn't like him and they kicked him out of the party. Yeah. But it's an important precedent for future presidents.
Yeah. And I'll put in a plug for Ulysses Grant.
We haven't talked about Grant yet.
He's the only president between Lincoln and McKinley to serve more than one term. Ulysses Grant is responsible for the Anti-Ku Klux Klan Act, for using the federal power, despite congressional opposition within his own party and despite violent opposition from southern states, using federal power to put down vigilante groups and other groups that at the local level are using violence to violate the Constitution. He was not entirely successful with that, but he was largely successful for at least a year or two in the early 1870s. The 1872 election is considered one of the fairest and most open of American elections after the Civil War until the 20th century because of Ulysses Grant. And one other point, the anti-Klan law and related laws pushed by Grant are being used today to prosecute the January 6th insurrectionists and to prosecute those who led the terrible white supremacist march in Charlottesville and various other places.
Great points. There have been some recent biographies of Grant aiming to resuscitate or revive his reputation. Why Woodrow Wilson? Why does Woodrow Wilson spark such ferocious debate?
So he sparks debate today, obviously, because that he was transformational in how he led the United States in the world. And also he is controversial in his racial views, frankly, in the 21st century. But let me just say this about Wilson, that every subsequent president, we do not ask if they are Wilsonian or not. We ask how Wilsonian are they? So Wilson sets the parameters for all of American foreign policy to follow. The idea that we are focused on national sovereignty, the idea that we focus on democracy, the idea that we focus on trade. And I think Wilson sets the standard by which all subsequent presidents are measured in terms of foreign policy.
And John F. Kennedy, he is revered by many to this day. He wasn't a one-term president. He was a 2.5-year president, inspirational. But how do we judge someone like Kennedy who was in office for a short time?
Well, he's overrated. He's an incredibly impressive figure. I will say the more you study and read about John F. Kennedy, the more impressed you are with his intellect, with his judgment, with his vigor, which Jeff mentioned earlier. But he didn't actually accomplish that much as president. And if we're judging presidents by the impact of their presidency, there's not much there. Now, Kennedy could have done a lot more, But it's quite clear that one of the single most important, impactful achievements of the 1960s was the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is passed by Lyndon Johnson and never would have been as comprehensive or as far-reaching as it was under John F. Kennedy. His inclination was not to go as far, and Lyndon Johnson used Kennedy's assassination as a mechanism for pushing that act much farther than it ever would have gone before.
LBJ, domestic policy, A+. Well, maybe the editors of the National Review would disagree with that. Foreign policy, largely responsible for the worst foreign policy disaster in American history, short of the Iraq War of 2003. We're talking about the Vietnam War. He is a difficult president to measure. I think most people look back on him as a failure because of Vietnam, but
I think he's a startling success and a startling failure at the same time. Everything is there. And his domestic policy is also very mixed. I mean, A+ on civil rights, but also he is the person who is the first to use the phrase law and order. He's the person who first invests in the Crime Act, which creates excessive policing, the foundation for the war on drugs, which is later built by Richard Nixon. So many of our criminal justice problems at home go back to Lyndon Johnson. Elizabeth Hinton has just written a whole book about this. He was a believer that government should step in and take control where it can, and it did a lot of good. But at times he overstepped. So in some ways, Reagan's critique of Johnson was not entirely misplaced.
Jeffrey Engel, you've been on the podcast before to talk about the Iraq War, the invasion in 2003, as the biggest strategic blunder in U.S. history. Well, Vietnam is right behind it.
Yeah, I think the difference between the two is actually quite interesting. That Vietnam, I think, is in many ways a slow-moving disaster. The phrase that we used to talk about in the 60s of the big muddy is a good example, that Johnson stepped in a step and a step and a step and a step at a time until finally he was over his head. George W. Bush dove into the pool. Right. The war in Iraq in 2003, I argue, was the worst strategic decision in American history because it was a choice. No doubt about it. And it was an immediate choice. So Johnson, I think we should also remember, is the one that Ronald Reagan actually critiques at the end of the day. Some might give him that A+ you mentioned for his domestic policy or for his civil rights. Ronald Reagan said that the problem with America wasn't the New Deal, it was the Great Society. That was the step too far, if you will, for the growth of the state, for the conservative movement, which provoked subsequent backlash, which has obviously altered the entire terrain of American politics.
I overstated the case with the A+, but you got my point. Johnson was trying to avoid a larger war by the way he prosecuted the war in Vietnam, and some of his domestic critics wanted him to stop altogether. Others wanted him to go much further.
Can I make just a final point on Johnson? And it comes back to where we started. The words presidents use matter enormously. The ways they speak to the public. The bully pulpit, as Theodore Roosevelt called it, is not fictitious. It's probably the most essential tool of a successful presidency. And Lyndon Johnson was not an articulate user of the bully pulpit, nor was Dwight Eisenhower. And that undermined their ability to shape public opinion. It undermined their ability to have impact, particularly true for Lyndon Johnson. If he had been better with his words, he might have actually been able to limit some of the negative consequences, at least of his domestic policies that were largely positive, but did have those negative consequences.
Jeremi Suri and Jeffrey Engel, you've given us a lot to think about in this whirlwind tour of American history. So some of the presidents we did not get to. Barack Obama, ranked 17th in the Siena College Research Institute survey. Bill Clinton was ranked 15th. John Adams, a one-termer who signed the Alien and Sedition Acts. He was ranked 14th overall. You can find the story page for this podcast episode at WashingtonTimes.com. There is a link to the survey results. You can check them out for yourself. On the next episode of History as It Happens, a special interview with Max Hastings, the great military historian, about...
And so bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour.
Like many heroic figures in our country, Winston Churchill is under attack by young activists on the left in the UK for his attitudes and actions toward Indians and Africans. Does history need heroes? That's next when we speak to Max Hastings as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.